Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 36th SIOP Annual Conference and this virtual panel discussion, Improving Engagement and Reducing Burnout with our brilliant thought leaders. The purpose of this discussion is to provide research, perspectives, and practical recommendations on how to improve engagement and reduce burnout in the evolving working world. The attention to both burnout and engagement have grown in many organizations and societies. Given what is known about the effects of stress and benefits of engagement, it seemed to be founded upon the appropriate balance of work demands and resources to meet those demands. Of course, the coronavirus pandemic has changed everything for everyone. Remote work is no longer a corporate benefit to request or negotiate, but a necessity for majority of people. It has changed the way people look at work. It has caused widespread economic uncertainty and increased employee concentration and also raised a lot of issues regarding employee well-being. Additionally, it is important to provide resources support needed for sustainability, especially as the pandemic continues to affect on our daily lives. Our goal is to provide valuable insights and to create a dialogue around what organizations can do to support their employees during these challenging times, while also managing employee performance. We hope these conversations will help practitioners navigate their search for practical tools and various initiatives to reduce burnout and improve engagement for their workplace. I pass it on to Michaela to introduce our panel members. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Anu. Let's start off with some introductions so that you can get to know your panelists today. First, I'll start off with a little bit about me. I'm a business services consultant at Invista, a division of PAR. During my time with Invista, I've developed employee well-being assessments, conducted retention analytic studies, and developed organizational interventions to improve employee well-being and reduce burnout and turnover. So as you can tell, this is a topic that I'm passionate about. Anu is my co-chair today and will be helping me facilitate this discussion. She's a certified coach and learning and organization development professional. She's a psychology graduate from University of Madras, India, and is passionate about designing result-oriented business solutions to improve employee experience, enhance engagement, and organizational success. She volunteers for the SIOP Learning Resources for Practitioners and SIOP Women in Network Committees. Currently, she is back to school to strengthen her business muscle at the Johns Hopkins University Carey Business School, pursuing the MA MBA Design Leadership Program. And for our panelists, I have the pleasure of working with Rachel, who also serves as a business services consultant at Invista. She earned her master's degree from Missouri State University. Using her knowledge of industrial organizational psychology, she assists organizations by designing assessments for selection, professional development, and employee well-being. While working for Invista, Rachel has worked on a number of projects, such as developing a practice interview guide for individuals struggling to find work, and creating team dynamic reports. This work has allowed her to combine her passions of helping people and applying IO to everyday life. Kimberly is a senior staff scientist at Humro. She holds a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Houston. She has nearly 25 years of consulting experience in the areas of assessment, development, and validation, training, organizational effectiveness, and program evaluation. She's been a remote employee for more than half of her career. Leveraging her success with remote work while at the American Institute for Research, she provided mentorship to staff that recently transitioned to working remotely and helped establish an employee resource group for remote workers. She is a trained coach who supports her clients in exploring and overcoming challenges, especially as they relate to remote work, to propel their career and personal development goals. Kristen is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She received her PhD in Industrial Organizational Psychology from Clemson University. Her research focuses on employee health and well-being, with specific interests in high-risk work environments, workplace stress, and social support. She also engages in consulting with local organizations in the areas of employee engagement and safety. She's a member of SIOP and the Society for Occupational Health Psychology and serves on the editorial board at Occupational Health Science. Ted is a research psychologist in the Northern Virginia area of the United States. He serves as an associate editor for consulting psychology journal Practice and Research. His main areas of practice and research include individual differences, inclusion, survey research, leadership derailment, and selection. I feel very fortunate to be surrounded by such an esteemed panel of experts. So without further ado, let's jump into the session. Anu is going to start off with a brief background.
Thank you, Michaela. In 1930s, industrial and organizational psychologists began to conduct anonymous employee surveys focused on job satisfaction. The term employee engagement measure appeared for the first time. Work engagement is the employee's willingness to invest themselves in their work roles fully, physically, cognitively, and emotionally, as stated by Kahn in 1990. It has significant beneficial effects on the organizational performance. The key drivers of employee engagement and performance are organizational trust, commitment to co-workers, and the right capabilities as defined by Wills in 2020. Disruptions of COVID tend to alter organizations' business landscapes and operating models. These critical drivers of employee engagement and performance remain unchanged. However, the interpretation of these key factors do change. Now, Kristen will take us through work demands. Over to Kristen.
Thanks. So I'll give a quick overview of what we mean by work demands. As work demands are another one of those drivers that can detract from engagement. So we can talk about job demands or stressors broadly as aspects of work that require sustained effort from us. Those can be physical demands that are actual physical labor, or even aspects of our physical work environment, like a lot of noise in the background that makes it difficult to concentrate. We experience social demands that can be actual interpersonal conflict, having to display certain emotions in our work, and navigating managing our work and non-work roles, which is particularly salient right now as some of those boundaries have become more permeable with remote work arrangements. We also have organizational demands that includes our workload, different policies or procedures that can make work more difficult, more generally the clarity of expectations that we have for what we're supposed to do and what we're held accountable to. Most of us probably know that as we describe these things, job demands can leave us feeling overwhelmed and stressed. But the thing is, job demands are inevitable, so we can't just remove them. And we wouldn't want to, because a lot of the job demands aren't purely bad. We have a category of demands or stressors that we refer to as challenge stressors that can motivate us and help us feel engaged in our work. We just want to be careful to not take that label too far, to get too far into that term of good stress, because even stress that motivates us and helps us perform can still harm our health and well-being if we have too much of it. So we want to know, how do we cope with negative effects of job demands? And it seems to be this balance that with negative effects of job demands, we can consider resources that help to offset those negative effects, at least to some degree. And those resources need to be sufficient and relevant. Resources can be anything that help us meet demands, support from the organization, autonomy over our decisions at work, or some personality traits that help us to be more resilient. And by relevant resources, I mean they need to match the type of demand you're experiencing. So if I have a very high workload, chances are having a massage chair in the break room doesn't really help meet that demand of a workload. We need maybe additional personnel or revised job duties to be the right resource to help us meet those demands. When we have demands that exceed our resources that we have to meet them, we typically experience a number of negative outcomes that can be organizational outcomes like productivity and turnover. It can also be for the worker harm to their personal well-being with some of those endpoints or concerns being mental or physical health problems or burnout, which Ted is going to define in some more detail in the next slides.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And let's talk a little bit about burnout and engagement. Burnout was originally developed as a concept by Christina Maslach back in the late 1970s, early 80s. It's been boiled down very well by her in a 2017 article in Consulting Psychology Journal into three major aspects, which are exhaustion, increased cynicism about work, and reduced professional efficacy. So those are the three aspects that you would see in someone who is experiencing burnout. There are health implications and, of course, job performance implications also, but from a descriptive perspective, you're going to see exhaustion, cynicism about work, and reduced professional efficacy. So what would we do about that? What we do about that is try to increase the person's level of engagement. Engagement was proposed originally as the antithesis of burnout. I want to propose right here also for you that I think the definition of engagement, or getting into issues around the definition of engagement, is a distraction. That's really about which consulting approach or journal article you wish to emphasize. Let's focus on what engagement does. From a functional perspective, engagement relative to burnout has three pieces, okay? Challenge, commitment, and control. The idea that the job challenges you appropriately, you feel committed to doing your best and to being part of the organization, and that's well known to be effective in terms of staying on the job versus attriting. And then a sense of control, sense that you get to influence, both as an individual contributor or as a manager, the amount of work that you do, where the work is done, the pace at which it is done, and and even the financial rewards you might have. So burnout, exhaustion, increased cynicism about work, and reduced professional efficacy, and then engagement as the antithesis of burnout. Maslach also emphasizes that engagement is the best approach to preventing burnout, right? But how would you do that? Well, there are a couple of main approaches for this. One is to fix the person. Now, fixing the person, there are a few key things you could do. All right, so if we want to affect exhaustion, an obvious approach, and one that the Army, for example, is taking, is to emphasize sleep. Sleep is well known to address issues around performance and plain old exhaustion. But there's also biofeedback. You could focus on diet. You might even want to have a mindfulness or bodily awareness intervention. Meta-analyses of random controlled trials show that mindfulness generally works, with some caveats and whatever. And all of those lead to revitalization, which is really important to deal with exhaustion. In terms of increased cynicism, essentially what we want to do there is clarify what's important to you. And by doing that, we're going to be talking about a few specific things. Work-life balance is the key. And I think coming out of the COVID pandemic, especially for people with small children or elder care responsibilities who have been having to balance too much at home, getting that work-life integration, work-life balance back upon return to workplace is going to take an immense amount of leadership effort to get right. But also at some level, at the individual performer level, you have to clarify what's important to you, clarifying your values and valuing your clarity. And I think, again, coming out of the pandemic, that's going to be something that people should do as part of reentry to work to be effective and feeling like you're making a difference. And finally, reduce professional efficacy. So what would we do there? Well, frankly, we're going to ask you to up your game. And how would you do that? Well, there's coaching. You could have peer coaching. You could have professional coaching. You could have mentoring. You could journal, which is highly effective. And I realize that just seems like another thing to do, but journaling as a way to reflect upon what you've done during the day is a way to note for yourself when you have been effective, what the situation was, what you did, and that should be highly effective in terms of increasing your sense of professional efficacy. All of those are oriented at fixing the person. You could also fix the job. So for example, you could talk about job sharing or job carving. And Arnold Backer has been very much at the forefront of that. The jobs demand resources model looks at the extent to which there are aspects of the job that are going to stress the person and what resources are available to meet those. Engagement is also, of course, at a high level, really important for fixing the job. And I talk about that from fixing the job because these are things you can get from your basic annual employee survey. You can ask about whether the person knows what's expected of them at work. Do they get to do what they do well every day? Does anybody care about them at work? Do their opinions count? Do they believe the mission of the organization is important? These are not copyrighted questions. If you like, you could get them off of the Office of Personnel Management's annual survey, the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. There are other organizations that have their own surveys too, but I think you get the idea. You want to take those results to fix the job as opposed to fixing the person in the job. There are some macro themes that Maslach emphasized, which revolve around workload, choice and control, recognition and reward, sense of community, which I believe, again, coming out of the COVID pandemic is going to be really important. People miss all those little water cooler interactions and the coffee breaks and that sort of thing. Sense of fairness and shared values. Inclusion is very important to a lot of people. And as we want to combat sense of burnout, what can we do to make people feel that they are included and that they aren't left out on their own because they just weren't on the team, because no one thought to include them? And also sense of mission. Once again, clarifying your values is going to be a macro theme that is going to be very important coming out of the pandemic. I also wish to emphasize, and this is something that will come up later, that you can be both engaged and burned out at the same time. Even though engagement is the antithesis of burnout, you can be both burned out and engaged because you're just doing the best thing in the world and you get exhausted from that. Or you get frustrated trying to achieve engagement and you just get more burned out. I suggest seeking intervention either from a peer or a trusted colleague, someone who can give you some perspective. And there are different ways to do that, and that's something that I think we'll be talking about in this presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Rachel.
Thank you, Ted. My portion of the presentation will focus on burnout and its relationship to well-being. So intuitively, I think we all know that burnout is not good for our health, but I want to share some of those relationships from the research. So physically, burnout has been linked to conditions such as heart disease, musculoskeletal pain, digestive issues, and headaches. Psychologically, individuals suffering from burnout have reported insomnia and increased hospitalization for mental illness. There are strong relationships between the symptoms of burnout as well as the symptoms of anxiety and depression. I do want to go off on a slight tangent here because I think it's important. I do want to point out that with these strong relationships between burnout and depression and anxiety, organizations have a great opportunity to impact both. So as organizations are striving to better manage burnout, a byproduct of those efforts could be to help support their employees who may be living with depression and anxiety without them ever needing to disclose that information. So I think that's just a neat opportunity that organizations have. So going back to the list, a few occupational outcomes include job dissatisfaction, increased injury, absenteeism, and presenteeism. A defining feature of burnout is its context, that it's specific to the workplace. So it's encouraging to see that 77% of employees believe that their employees' well-being is their responsibility, with burnout being one of those areas where they can drive change. With all its negative consequences, it's imperative for organizations to strategize how they can reduce burnout. In Maslach and Leiter's research, they identified 6 domains within the work environment that lead one to burnout. And Ted already touched on these, so we're not going to cover them again. We can take workload, for example. So we all kind of differ in how much workload we can handle, but there comes a point when just too great of a workload could increase someone's likelihood to experience burnout. They also proposed that employees are greater risk when there's a mismatch between their expectations and the actual factors going on in the workplace. So values is a good example. So if an employee values sustainability, but the organization is polluting the air, that mismatch is going to cause frustration and potentially lead to burnout over time. Also, the more negative that employees rate all of these areas within the workplace, the more likely they are going to experience burnout. This makes sense that if you're rating your workplace very negatively, you may be checking the box of that cynicism component for burnout. With the knowledge of these areas that can lead employees to burnout, there is opportunity to intervene. There's many interventions out there, but I want to share a couple that align well with our IO expertise. IOs love to assess things, so they can help the organizations measure burnout, well-being, as well as those common workplace factors. They can establish a baseline and follow the trends time after time. If they implement an intervention, say on fairness, and they promote transparent processes, they can use that data to measure if that was effective over time. That data can also be used by organizations to pinpoint areas of support, and they can use that to invest in more targeted benefits based on what their employees need. Managers have close contact with their employees, so their influence on employee well-being is very important. A simple intervention is to just ask and make it a regular topic to talk about well-being. We'll talk about this more in the Q&A, how to have productive and appropriate conversations. Managers can also establish healthy norms and share what they're doing to take care of their well-being and prevent against burnout. Managers are also in a great position to advocate for their team. So going back to that workload example, if an initiative is placed on a team and it's just not a great time for them to handle it, a manager can advocate to those above and say, hey, my team's not in a good place to take this, their workload's too great, and be that support for them if they can't have that voice. At the employee level, a great first step is to self-assess. There's lots of great tools and apps out there. I've linked the Mayo Clinic's question because I think they're nice, basic, reflective questions just to get a good understanding of where you're at. So what do you do with that information after you have taken a self-assessment? Unfortunately, there's not a one-size-fits-all. It's very personalized in what works best for you. However, the organization can educate on strategies, provide resources that can help employees know what to do should the time come where they are experiencing burnout. Also, regardless of whether you're trying to prevent burnout or you're currently in it and trying to combat it, voice your needs to your manager. We'll discuss how to do that more in the Q&A, but speaking up is so important for your own health and well-being. And now I'll pass it over to Kimberly to continue the well-being discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. So we've heard about the importance of work-life integration and control, and one way that individuals had been striving for that prior to the pandemic was to seek out opportunities for part-time or full-time teleworking arrangements, which had been shown in the research to have positive outcomes on productivity, absenteeism, voluntary turnover, as well as for the organization's perspective on real estate costs if they were able to downsize their office space. So IOs, we've been accumulating a body of research on telework and productivity and how it relates to engagement, and seeing very positive outcomes with that. And of course, the pandemic changed everything. Remote work no longer became a benefit that people were negotiating for, but rather it was a necessity. And with that came a very unique way. The remote work isn't happening the same way it would have been prior to the pandemic. Individuals are working at home as well as caring for other family members, helping educate their children, having to share the house, their living space, with others who are also engaged in working from home. So it's created a very different environment and resulting in distress that people had not had before. There had been a tendency around remote work and this emphasis in our research on productivity and engagement to really focus on what people were getting done in the day while working remotely. And we really need to kind of focus our research now, start building a body of research around the well-being and engagement of people working from home. Recent research during the pandemic conducted by Keller, Knight, and Parker, they identified 6 factors of work that were significantly and strongly correlating with psychological distress while working remotely during this pandemic. And these factors predicted 48% of the variance in psychological distress. And when they took into account things like gender and age, that prediction continued. And in fact, even those individuals who are experienced working from home, they were seeing that these distress factors were accounting for the variance for them in terms of what they were experiencing. So although no playbook exists for this pandemic, there are some things that company leaders and managers can do to serve as a beacon of hope and encouragement for self-care for their employees, which would help minimize the distress and, as a result, work on enhancing engagement and reducing burnout, as we've heard earlier, that those go hand in hand. What do I mean by being a beacon? So take the B, for instance, that is build trust through compassion and understanding. As a leader, really understanding what are the perspectives that your employees have based on their situation right now, and then having frequent and clear communications, ensuring that the mode of technology matches the message. So examples here, you could have weekly self-care or well-being announcements that are incorporated into a newsletter or the social media postings that your employees follow or onto the company intranet site. Managers can also be sending those kinds of messages to their staff, focusing on trusting them and understanding where they're at and avoiding assuming that you understand their situation. So creating an open environment for that. And then kind of related to that in terms of the communication and is the E, and that is for encourage open communication. And here I focus, it's obviously you want open communication with your employees, but also encouraging that open communication among the team members with each other. So creating opportunities for them to have meaningful connections. As Ted said, they're missing that coffee break or water cooler conversation. So building time into the beginning of a meeting for that kind of communication, or establishing meetings strictly for that purpose of sharing information, building connections, helping them help each other through these challenging times. And it might not all be around their work environment, but also around how they're doing their work or what benefits are available to them and how to leverage them. So maybe there's company benefits that people don't know about or they don't know how to leverage. Again, just encouraging feedback as well as gathering feedback from them on what's working and what's not. So if they're not wanting to share, then that's something you should know, and maybe you need to create a more intimate environment than at the team level for those communications. The next one is address technological challenges. Many of us were thrown into remote work. Our computers are still in the office. We don't have all the same resources, and we're dealing with a lot of challenges to do our jobs on a daily basis just from a technology perspective. So gathering information about what is it that might be impacting them or adding frustrations to their workday. Maybe it's an equipment need. Maybe they need maybe there's someone in the office who can pack up their equipment and ship it to their home, or they can create a safe way for them to come and retrieve their stuff if they haven't already. Maybe they just need IT support, and instead of just saying, well, contact IT, as a manager, really assisting them with that communication with IT and getting the support that they need in terms of seeking the IT support. Maybe it's finding out afterwards, did it help? And are there other things to do? Don't just assume that because they contacted IT that all technology challenges were resolved. And then if there are needs for new equipment and there are funds for that, then it would be making sure that there's an approval process and that everybody understands it and is able to use it. So not putting it back on the employee will do a lot for their well-being, and then in turn help them for engagement. So the C is for creating a sense of security. So these are times where individuals are worried about the viability of the company or the long-term nature of their job, whether they're still going to have a job at any given time. So really dedicate time for one-on-one meetings to find out what is creating a lack of security for individuals, because it won't be the same for everyone. And then as you're listening, look for opportunities to demonstrate that their insecurities may not be as strongly founded as they might feel like they are. So explain how their work aligns with the team's objectives or the organizational strategy, or opportunities to share, and this can happen at the company level, organizational leaders, or it could happen at the managerial level, but explaining where new opportunities have been created and how it's strengthening the company should that exist. And so really focusing on building some security for them, because when they're worried about the longevity of their job, where the money is going to come from if they lose it, then that will obviously have a detrimental impact on their well-being. So then in terms of work-life integration, we heard Ted and Rachel discuss that. And there are strategies that individuals could take to minimize their work-life interferences. And Ted and Rachel had talked about the control and where and when and how the work is done. And that is extremely important right now. But in addition to that, I know I mentioned about these one-on-one meetings or team building meetings in some form or fashion. We do have some concerns about just too many meetings and people getting burned out on the virtual meetings. But I would say if you were going to try to limit meetings, don't take those out. Instead, find ways to make your work-related meetings more productive. Have an agenda, determine whether there's enough things on the agenda to warrant still having the meeting. If not, then reschedule it or shorten it, and build in time before and after your work-related meetings for little breaks or for some of these conversations that I was suggesting. Also, we heard Rachel talking about establishing the supportive norms, and these are going to be different at different times. When we're all working from home, then those norms might be different than when some are back in the office and some are still working from home. But we need to, as a manager, really gather the information from our team to figure out what those norms should be. Don't just assume you know, and then have them discuss it. So some of these norms might be things like a period of time where you're not expected to answer emails, whether it's 7 to 9 at night, or maybe it's sometime in the middle of the day when, if most of your team members are trying to deal with schooling their children on, or feeding them lunch or picking them up from school. Thinking about how those might have to change over time as the situations with school and daycare and elder care changes for individuals. I guess the last one, the end, that is just, we talked about the workload issues, neutralize those issues to the best of our ability right now. Figure out where are there overloads or underloads even, because that could be stressful in and of itself. If you're expected to be working, but your work has gone away and you're having to figure out what else you can do to fill your day, that can be just as frustrating. Gather input from your team members. Figure out on a one-on-one level, what do they value? What's going to be stimulating to them? What do they need to balance that work? Also, I would say in terms of well-being, looking for opportunities for new skill development for your staff so that they feel like the work is meaningful, because meaningful work will generate that sense of well-being and engagement for them. So those are some of the strategies that I have used in my own personal experience, as well as many that have been curated through many different sources, including the Working Through COVID-19 Resource Center that the Learning Resources for Practitioners Committee had established early in the pandemic, and it's available free to the public, not just SIOP members, on the SIOP website under remote work.
And as the chair of that committee, we've been working for a year now, a little over a year, on creating those resources and making them available. And so a lot of what I shared has been shared through those resources. So check them out if you want to learn more. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Kristen walked us through the impact of work demands in context of physical, psychosocial, and organization. Ted introduced us to burnout and functional aspects of engagement. He also suggested creative approaches to fix the person and fix the job, to manage burnout and create engagement. Rachel helped us understand how burnout impacts employee well-being. She presented 6 warning signs in the workplace to watch out for. Also suggested organizational, managerial, and employee-level interventions to prevent or combat burnout and influence well-being. Finally, Kimberly discussed well-being and its relationship to engagement, and how to be a beacon of hope and encouragement for self-care. Now we move to Michaela's and my favorite part of the session, to engage with our thought leaders to have deeper conversations. Over to Michaela to lead the question and answers.
First question, how can organizations support employees who are both engaged and burnt out? Rachel, would you like to kick us off?
I'd be happy to. So we see this commonly in mission-driven work. So that includes nonprofits and healthcare. Probably the most effective way is to intervene at the source. So really to look at what is causing that burnout and fix that. But we know that there's not always time for that and not time to intervene as well as you would like. So one suggestion is to promote self-care, which is easier said than done, right? But organizations can teach their employees how to do that, why it's not selfish, how they can fit it into a busy schedule, and also have leaders promote it and take part in it themselves. Another interesting tip that I read from Jennifer Moss, which was written pre-pandemic and before resilience was really the buzzword of 2020, was to be cautious in how we talk about resiliency, because it implies that burnout isn't the employee's fault because they weren't resilient enough. So I thought that was a very interesting way on how our words can really make a difference in the organization.
I think that's such a good point. And the purpose-driven work makes so much sense because you're so invested, and I think self-care is critical. So Kimberly, what advice would you add to that?
So I think it kind of goes along with this in that there is evidence to suggest that if you're supporting others, it somehow takes the focus off of yourself and kind of helps you get over those negative feelings that come with burnout, because now you're focusing on helping others. And so maybe sort of around the same idea that when people in the mission or nonprofit work are feeling that burnout, that might be exactly how they get over it. And we can apply that in a lot of different environments, just getting outside of our own experience and focusing on others and look for those opportunities might be just enough of a catalyst to help us.
Yep, I love that. Helping others often helps us as well. I think, these tips are a great transition into my next question, which is really, how can organizations make sure that employees are using the resources provided that can help prevent burnout? Kristen, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
I think that's a great question and something that a lot of workers struggle with, particularly with demanding workplaces and lots of work hours for many of us. I think one good example to draw from is from the work family literature and practice, where oftentimes we have family-friendly benefits that are there, but we don't feel like we can really use them. Maybe this is, you have flexible work opportunities, but you have a supervisor that maybe discourages you in some way from using them, whether that's simply saying, well, you can take the day off, but we're going to be behind, or someone else is going to have to pick up the slack. And that points out that the informal dynamics of the workplace have to make it comfortable for workers to use the resources that they have, whether that's flexible work, opportunities to take breaks, or seek support. So workers really need to feel comfortable asking for time off, making requests if their workload is too high, or taking advantage of time off to deal with a mental health concern. So when we directly or indirectly send messages that someone may be weak or lazy or incompetent, if they use some of those resources, then we're not really allowing workers to be resilient in the face of demand. So we talked about, well, someone has to be resilient as a person, but they need resources in order to build that resilience. I think that's one big area, is working on those informal dynamics to reinforce the use of resources that can help us to thrive even when we have high demands.
Absolutely. And, I think as leaders, we have to practice what we preach as well and show that we have meaning behind what we say. And I'm going to demonstrate it. So I want you to do it as well. Rachel, what would you add to that?
Yeah, those were great points. A couple that I would add, if you are administering surveys already, maybe add a couple of questions just to see, have your employees answer the usefulness of some of the benefits and resources that they're using. You can also pair that with usage statistics that vendors often provide when you use their benefits. To some extent, you can't fully know if they're using it and using it well, but you can make it as easy as possible for them to access it. So some ways that can look like hosting a lunch and learn to show people how to actually log into the EAP and use it, or having leaders promote it and talk about resources that they've used in hopes of hopefully reducing that stigma that it's not okay to seek help.
Absolutely. We invest all these resources into, these different initiatives. So we want to make sure that employees are getting the most use out of them as well. My next question is, what challenges were overcome in the shift from on-site to remote work? And how can organizations prepare for a possible transition back to work? Kimberly, with your wide experience surrounding remote work, what advice would you give?
So I think for the current situation, the emphasis should be on that we're not going to be able to just hit a switch and everyone is back in the office, that there's going to need to be transition, and information is going to need to be collected at the organizational level to understand what's going to work best for the employees. With a likely daycare shortage, there's going to be situations where some people are not able to make it back to the office. They're still working on figuring out how to care for their children and do so safely. And so recognizing that there will have to be some decisions made and changes to processes, and making sure that you have the information to make an informed decision will be extremely important.
That's a perfect transition into my next question, which is just with work and family demands pulling employees in different directions. How can organizations ensure that employees are engaged while working remotely, and what can employees do? Kristen, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Sure. I think a big thing is acknowledging that organizations really have a great opportunity to make it clear that they acknowledge and respect and understand that workers are balancing a lot right now, and sending that message that's less, we want to make sure you're working, but more supporting, like, hey, I know that things are hard right now. What can we do to make sure that you can still do your work and do it well? Because at the end of the day, most people choose jobs that they find some meaning in and can find some motivation. So trying to give the resources to continue that motivation, and making sure that they can be productive by allowing flexible work arrangements. This is a time like none other that we may not be able to work our traditional 9 to 5. We need some flexibility. And even for workers that can't work remotely, do they have some voice into their schedule? Because I think a lot of times as IOs, our lens is for typical office work, but then you even have to think through, how do we accommodate restaurant and retail workers, that remote work really isn't a possibility, but how can you still provide voice and make sure people are able to work in ways that they can still get in their hours or complete their tasks, but do it in a way that's going to work for them. And for workers, the question, of course, was staying engaged with working. And I think one big part of staying engaged with working as employees is just setting reasonable expectations for ourselves, because things change. I personally had to adapt my schedule that I couldn't work 9 to 5 from home. I'd miss those interruptions and those times that I had to think flexibly and experiment even with different work hours that still preserved my values for having rest and having time to take a break. So I think making sure we are flexible and try new things and don't get too mad at ourselves when something doesn't work. We need lots of reasonable expectations right now as we transition and even transition back to a more typical work environment for many.
Absolutely. I love that advice. Kimberly, what would you add to that?
So as Ted was saying earlier, the practicing the mindfulness, so you'll have some awareness about where you are with your engagement and what you're feeling and what might be the challenges for you. And thinking about yourself, like if you leverage Shockley and Clark's research, they talk about some people are integrators, so they can easily transition from the meeting and, fix their kids' lunch at the same time. And others, they really need their work segmented. And so they're going to get up extra early in the morning before the whole family wakes up to get some of their work done. And then likewise, maybe on the tail end of the day, they find some quiet time. So they really need separation. So understanding where you are on that continuum and organizing your work, and back to what I was saying earlier about, being honest and communicating it when the opportunity is presented from your manager to share that, what you're needing, what kind of norms do you need for your teamwork. And then just really exploring being creative. It's going to be trial and error, what works for you and what doesn't. And if you're dealing with children at home, just knowing that as soon as you figure it out, they're going to change because they're growing and changing constantly. And all of a sudden, what you were doing doesn't work anymore and you have to adjust. So just knowing that it really is trial and error. No one knows the answer for you specifically. You have to explore it yourself.
Absolutely. Our next question, what do we do to correct workplace cultures where stress is the badge of honor? Kristen, I know this is an area you're passionate about. So what can we do to fix those cultures?
I got really interested in this concept, and it was the focus of my dissertation that we've seen anecdotally and now with some research that there seems to be these cultural values sometimes that we tend to glorify stress and busyness, whether we admit it or not. We're probably guilty of competing with our friends or coworkers or even spouses for who's the most stressed and who has the most responsibilities. So I think really we just have to start as individual workers and stop finding our pride and boasting in our busyness and our stress, because I think it perpetuates that expectation of this is what success looks like and this is what normal looks like. And I think in organizations, we need to think about our informal rewards. Do we tend to look at the worker who spends 10 hours a day at work and responds to emails at all hours of the day as our model worker? We wish everyone could be like them. And that may be their work style, and that's great, but it shouldn't be our standard and our expectation. And I think we can develop that better in our mentorship for new employees and how we support one another. In general, I think this is something that we really have to tackle, because our stress management efforts are never going to be effective if people don't see their stress as a problem, and if they see it as normal and even impressive that I handle these high amounts of stress regularly. So when it becomes the norm, I think we're going to lose sight of managing it well, and we're going to accept that high level as normal. So I think as individuals and organizations, we have to work on those norms and understand what that truly does to us and how that can affect our well-being if we adapt to always being stressed.
Absolutely. I think that's, an important perspective that sometimes we have to reorient ourselves on. So thank you for that advice. How do employees have productive conversations with their managers about burnout and vice versa? Rachel, you want to kick us off on this question?
So let's talk about manager to employee first. So managers often avoid these conversations because they can be uncomfortable. They're sometimes worried about saying something inappropriate, and those all are valid reasons. But let's break down some strategies so that they have more productive conversations. So simply opening the conversation by asking, "How are you today?" is a great place to start and kind of see where the conversation goes from there. If you've noticed changes in their behavior, you can bring that up and state very factually what you've noticed, but avoid assumptions. You don't know what's going on or why they're acting the way that they are. Then listening is the best thing that you can do. If they do share something with you, respond with empathy and then ask what they need. Allow the employee to generate solutions themselves so that you're not rushing in to make accommodations that an employee may not actually need. And then follow up later and see how they're doing and if a solution is working for both of you. So a couple key points. As a manager, do not ask direct questions about their health. You're not there to diagnose, and it also gets into very sticky territory. It's okay if they don't want to talk to you, but you've at least opened the door to make it normal to have these conversations and that you care about them. Then on the flip side, for employees to approach managers about burnout, I would recommend the book Crucial Conversations. It's a great book that breaks down how to have challenging conversations of all topics. I mean, you can really apply it to any situation. But first, start with your shared goal. And in this case, it's probably that you want to perform well in your job and your manager also wants you to perform well in your job. State your observations and your experiences, and then listen to what your manager's response is. I would recommend coming to the conversation prepared with solutions that you've already thought through so that you can discuss together. When you land on one that you can both agree on, implement it and then follow up to make sure it's meeting both of your needs. It can be challenging, especially early in your career or new in a job when you really want to prove yourself, but it's so important to have the conversation in order to take hold of your own well-being.
I love that you mentioned the book Crucial Conversations. I think that's just a great read, no matter the conversations you're having, whether at work, at home, wherever. Ted, what would you add to this?
Well, Rachel really covered a lot of stuff. I just have a few ideas. Another good book is Radical Candor by Kim Scott. It's a good book to have in your back pocket to set up these conversations. One thing that's really important to keep in mind, first of all, most managers are not mental health professionals. Even if they are mental health professionals, they're in a position of supervision, not mental health provision. So you want to be really careful about getting into someone's personal stresses and whatever. You want to keep it at a work level. Number two, burnout is not a performance management issue, but it could become one. So it could be a developmental issue. It could be a returning from work issue. It could be things that you're not as a leader really going to get into, like family issues. So you want to clarify what it is relative to the person's work assignments. There are a lot of jobs that are not white-collar jobs out there, and they're dangerous and dirty. You can get hurt or even killed in a lot of jobs in the United States. And people can get burned out from that because they're working really hard to serve a larger purpose. Or maybe they've just seen nothing really change from their perspective. You can get burned out by that from the cynicism aspect. An answer here, and it's going to be an answer elsewhere, is you don't want to suffer in silence. You want to encourage the conversation both up and down. So looking down, you have your survey results, or maybe you just manage by walking around. You see people away from everybody else, or just looking kind of down. You can have a conversation about how things are going and how's work going and what do you think about things we're doing. Looking up too, you could not suffer in silence, and if you realize that you're becoming cynical, you're feeling like you don't have any more efficacy, you just can't get it done, nothing you do seems to make a difference. And I could see that being really important in not only healthcare but also law enforcement or intelligence work. It just seems like we never know what the outcome is, or people keep dying around here. And literally they might. You want to bring that to your boss as part of a conversation starter, not as a hard no, like I can't do my job because nothing seems to change, but it just seems like what I've done in the past to be effective isn't working anymore. I'd like to work through some ideas with you. That's a really good conversation to bring to your boss so that your boss can make suggestions along the lines of peer coaching or mentoring and things like that. One thing to keep in mind is that most leaders or long-tenured employees in an organization that have burnout cultures have survived in that culture. They may even have thrived in that culture. So they may not see it to the same extent a newer person might. Because from their perspective, and both Rachel and Kristen mentioned this, it's kind of like they just figure, well, what the heck, rub some dirt on it and get back to work. I made it through, why can't you? So you got the sense of people not, especially long tenured or leaders in an organization, not remembering what it was like when they were starting out and things were hard. So having that conversation is important. That way you can address both the person and the situation, which is a pretty good combination.
Absolutely. I love that. Don't suffer in silence.
Don't suffer in silence.
Yeah.
Whatever you do, always ask for help. And if you don't feel strong enough to ask for help, ask someone to help you ask for help.
I want to add to a point Ted made. I love the idea that there are definitely organizations and whole occupational groups that get into that mentality of, I suffered through it, you should too, and I made it through it. But I think we need to start questioning our leaders. Well, why? Like, you need to do it because I did? I don't know if that's a good enough reason. What value does it add as a worker? What skills does it build? Are there other ways to build those skills? So I think particularly in high stress occupations, we need to start questioning, why is that the norm, and is it a productive norm?
Well, you get into the generational issues too, which I'm not going to talk about. I hope no one else talks about, because I don't want to talk about it anymore. But you know what this is, right? Well, I got tenure. I worked 80 hours a week. You know, I had 3 kids while I was working 80 hours a week and getting tenure. Why can't you? You know, something like that. That's out there. Again, senior employees or leaders tend to look at the people coming up and think, well, they've got to earn it. You know, they have to, I'm going to show them the ropes. This is how we do things here. But pushing back on that in terms of, I really want to be more productive. I really want to be effective. I want to be part of the team. I want to feel like I'm making a contribution, is a way to get out of that badge of honor thing effectively. Now, you know, whether it works for every leader, I don't know. That's part of the conversation you have to have.
Yep, absolutely. Well, as professionals that all work in demanding roles, I'd just like to open up to the group my last question, which is, what self-care strategies have you found helpful to prevent burnout in your work? Who wants to kick us off there? Ted, you want to jump in on that one?
I haven't talked as much as other people have, but I've talked too much. But anyway, I'll just start off and then I'll stop talking. Clarifying your values. Why are we here? How is this working for you? How could I have better work-life integration? What's really important to me? And it could be a paycheck. Look, there's nothing wrong with working for making more money. I wish I could influence my salary by working harder. But sometimes you can't. And sometimes those other rewards in terms of personal positive relationships, serving customers, helping people get out of difficult situations, helping people heal, seeing the road that you built, those are all very positive things. So identifying what your values are, what's important to you, and then trying to align what you do with those values is a great self-help process, because it helps you become engaged, and become engaged in a positive way to avoid the negative aspects of burnout.
Absolutely. Rachel, what would you add to that?
I'll add that I know I spent a lot of time talking about conversations, both directions, and that's one that I've been trying to practice, and which has been a struggle, especially early in a career, but just bringing what's going on to my manager's attention. Sometimes I can't or don't always get what I need from that conversation. So when that happens, I've done a much better job of asking, how can I prioritize, and working through that with a manager rather than, as Ted said, suffering in silence. So that's been one strategy that's worked well for me.
Kristen, what would you add?
I think a resounding theme that I've had to think about self-care, particularly during the pandemic, has been to focus just on how to manage my energy better. And that is not my term. Someone actually referenced an article they read that talked about energy management versus time management. And I can't remember the original source, but I thought, well, what a neat idea to think less about how do I manage this time in the day and how do I manage the energy that I had. So I've been trying to do better, to take breaks, to schedule lunches with people, to have social relationships, and even recognizing how you work better when you have restored your energy. So I think lots of times we get in that habit of, I can't afford to take a break right now, I have so much to do. But sometimes I'm reminding myself, I can't afford to not take a break, because the way I'm working right now is not effective. So even if there's a whole literature on micro breaks, taking 5 minutes to walk around the neighborhood or to stand up. I had a grad student the other day that told me she turned on a song and danced for a few minutes in between studying for exams to regain energy. And I thought those are really neat and practical ways to take those breaks, learn when you work best, and put your most important projects during that time, and cut yourself some slack when you hit that 2 o'clock slump. And if you're like me, my brain just slowly stops functioning. So I've learned to stop, take a break, move away, and try to regain your energy, because that's the best resource we have to meet the demands of our work.
Absolutely. I love that. Energy management. Kimberly, what final tips would you share that you use for self-care?
So for me personally, I really have committed to a healthy lifestyle of eating healthy and exercising every day. And it is challenging. Sometimes the pressing desire to want to get the work off my plate and just keep going is very strong. But I have to remind myself that it's important to go at a steady pace, and things can wait. So having my workspace in a different place from where I spend time with the family or sleep has been important for me. And doing something at the end of the day to have that transition from work to home life has also been important. So that's when I do my workout, because that's kind of a transition time. All these years I've been working from home, I always said, well, the one thing I kind of wish I had was a commute, because the commute home would help me turn it off. And I really had a hard time turning it off. I don't really want to sit in traffic. I just want to drive. So there's someone said to me one time, well, why don't you just take a drive? It never occurred to me to just drive for no reason. But there you go. That might be a strategy, is just to get away from it. I engage, well, I'd be remiss in not saying this as a coach, but I also have a coach who I work with. And that I find very effective, because that gives me that accountability of, like, did I take the breaks that I was supposed to take? Did I do my workout? How am I doing on my healthy eating? I know that not everyone financially is in a place to engage in coaching, but I will say that there are so many coaches out there that are working pro bono or some type of bartering type situation in order to get their hours for their certifications through the ICF. And so there are ways I would contact a university or one of the programs that offers a coaching program and tell them you're interested in some free coaching, because all those individuals that are studying to become a coach or practicing to get their certification are giving free coaching right now. And I've given it, I've partaken in it, and I think it's a very valuable strategy to help keep yourself on course, because sometimes it's hard to dig deep and get your own resources to do the right thing for yourself.
Great advice. Well, I know personally this has been such an insightful session, and I've learned some great strategies to really help make sure that employees are engaged and focusing on well-being so they don't get burned out, and also how to recognize, and reduce burnout in myself. So I want to thank you all for taking time to have this important discussion, and to our listeners out there, thank you for joining our session. If you have any questions for this panel of experts, please feel free to send us a message, and we'd love to get back to you. Hope to see you guys next year in person.